is our fourth webinar focusing on supporting monthly meetings and other houses of worship who are interested in creating disaster plans in response to natural weather events that are increasing in our region. My name is Paula Klein, and I'm the clerk of the Concord Corridor Climate Action Working Group. And we were formed last year in January, and we agreed to tackle this year in 2022 the issue of disaster preparedness, because many of us feel this is a real urgent need right now to consider because of the extreme weather we've seen in our region. Flooding, severe flooding, tornado watches fairly frequently for the first time in many of our lives here in Pennsylvania, and obviously what we're experiencing this week, which is extreme heat. In earlier sessions, in our very first session, we shared a quotation from the Lutherans, which I'm going to go to here, which explains in part why we're doing this series. It says that in times of disaster, our communities, people, will seek refuge in the church, and in our case for Quakers, monthly meetings, because it's a community meeting place, because there they'll find shelter and food, or because they will find God there. People in our communities will likely come knocking on our doors, whether or not we're prepared to open them. And it is with this hope, this hope that the Lutheran congregations created a guide to help leadership not only be prepared to open their doors, but to be ready and willing to faithfully do so. So what we created was a 4-part series, all of which have been recorded, that will guide us through a process of understanding the components and the steps involved in creating a disaster preparation plan for your meeting or house of worship. So in the first session, we actually looked at the context that we're in and what are the steps involved in creating a plan and taking a kind of deep dive in the resources that are available for us. And in the second session, which was held in March, we looked specifically at the health risks for our region by listening to a physician talk about the impacts of extreme weather events. And then we spoke with a coordinator for the regional body that oversees disaster management, which is a member of the Lutheran Church in this case, to understand what the cycle of disaster management looks like and what are our goals of resilience. And then in our previous session, which was held in May, we looked at how to protect our buildings, our physical buildings, whether or not we have schools or other programs in our buildings. And we took a closer look at flooding and what to do to prevent impact from bad flooding, but also how to respond to tornadoes, both to prepare your building, but also if a tornado strikes when you have people in the building. So this is our last formal informational session, and the focus is on emotional, spiritual care and worship in times of disaster. And those of us who've been participating, there are 5 or 6 monthly meetings who've been doing this together. We're hoping to have actual plans in place by October. So I want to start by just doing a quick review of what is the cycle of disaster for those of you who were with us in the first session. It's a reminder for others that might be a first time to look at it. And as you can see, it's considered a cycle because you can't prevent future incidents from happening. There's an incident that happens. In our case, it could be a flood or a tornado or a series of high heat days, a hurricane. And there's an emergency response. It's something that happens from the first hours after the incident occurs to days after. And then the next phase is when relief work begins, where you're actually trying to support, not just doing kind of emergency effort, but then you're trying to prepare people for a long-term recovery. And what we've learned is that when we think about spiritual and emotional care, there are actually stages of the disaster that there are emotional responses and spiritual needs that unfold in response to the cycle of disaster. And I'd like you to take a look at this slide as I read a little bit about this process. So thinking about that there are stages in a disaster, an event, immediate response, preparation for relief work, sort of staging to do more thorough work, and then the long period of recovery. And that timeline, people actually call this the emotional roller coaster of disaster. And while the emotional reactions of individuals and communities are always unique, they also tend to follow a predictable pattern. At any given moment, though, you have to keep in mind that not everyone will be at the same position on the roller coaster. As time passes, people become emotionally and physically tired. And so if you look at this chart, which I find really helpful, you may get, there's a threat, there's a tornado warning, and then it hits. And usually there's an immediate period of adrenaline and response, and they call it the heroic period, where everyone who's in rescue mode. And then there's what they call the honeymoon period, where there's real cohesion, everybody pulls together. But then, as I was saying, time passes and people become exhausted, and you actually see snags in the recovery. Weaknesses in our systems become more apparent. And all of these lead to a fairly rapid and steep drop in disillusionment, despair, sometimes hopelessness, and a feeling of helplessness. Effective outside assistance that not only brings resources and additional person power, but also respects and encourages survivors in their community to make informed decisions and to do what they can for themselves, can help bring hope as the community recovery processes are developed. Gradually, people work through their grief, develop effective recovery plans, and take more control of their lives, and eventually reach what, if you see under the word reconstruction, a new normal. So while some of us are actually qualified to serve as social workers or therapists, psychologists, even construction workers, people who know how to use chainsaws or be case managers, it's important that those of us who attend Meeting for Worship or other houses of worship, that we have a primary call to serve as spiritual leaders. And it's also vital to all of us who tend to choose these roles to be really attentive to our own self-care and respite so that we don't burn out when it happens. We have to keep in mind that recovery is not a short-term sprint, but really can be a grueling marathon. So we need to let our faith, our compassion, and our professional training, when we have it, guide us. So the focus of today is to help us understand what resources we already have and understand and can get access to about the emotional needs of victims, survivors, and people who are impacted by disaster, whether it's in the first couple days or in the weeks and months that follow. So we've invited Nora Wright to come and share with us the work that she's done and understands to be helpful for us as we think about how to prepare our plans that would include emotional and spiritual support, and specifically around worship. So today, we're hoping to talk a little bit about our role as people of faith, about the phases of adult and emotional spiritual responses to disasters, what might be some guiding principles and best practices we could all tuck away for that rainy day, understanding children's responses, since most of us serve families and not just in the adult community, and specific tools to help children. And then we'll address the role of worship. So I want to welcome and thank Nora for joining us today, and I turn it over to her.
Thank you so much. Such a privilege to be here. All right, can everybody see that? Yep, good. Well, thank you again for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I am a social worker and a therapist, and I have had a focus on grief and processing traumatic events for quite some time. I started my work in the prison system, working with offenders, people who had harmed others, and victims, folks who had been victims of violent crimes, to bring them together for conversations as a part of a very powerful restorative justice process. And more recently, I've been working in private practice with couples and families processing grief and loss from traumatic events and losses in their families and in their communities. And today I want to really take that to the community level to support you to think about how to offer spiritual support, worship, and create a plan for that, and considering the mental health of the folks in your community in the case of a natural disaster. And I want to honor, this is hard work and it's really important work, and I appreciate you taking some time to think about it in advance before you need it. Okay. Let's start by thinking about who we serve during and after a natural disaster. Creating a plan really needs us to know who this plan is for. And when we are a spiritual or a religious organization, we may be in that moment discern that we're really speaking to our members and attenders. We may feel that we have a larger a responsibility to the larger community, or we may tune in as committees and discern that we have a particular population that we want to serve, such as a first responders, or we really want to minister and support children. So that's a discernment that we need to do before we can create a plan, so that we know how to reach those people and what we want to do to reach them. Okay. Let's just start with an example so you can kind of have an idea for where we're going. In this case, during a tornado, a gas explosion kills residents, including children. I would love to just open, anyone can unmute and share. What would your meeting or congregation do in response to this? What could your meeting do, just at the top of your head?
Marilyn, I think what first comes is physical care.
Mm-hmm.
And just offering also time for any expression. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
Nora, one thing that one piece of physical care that can be offered is that when disasters happen that cause destruction of homes and things like that, adults often have to do a lot of cleanup work and care for children, simply care for children, occupying children, with good, qualified adults or qualified caregivers, keeping children occupied while their parents, their otherwise caregivers respond to the immediate physical disaster. It can be a good help.
Thank you so much for saying that. And we're going to actually talk about why really sensitive populations to be tuned into are children, which is kind of obvious, but also parents, that there's this kind of job that they have that never ends, and having some support to be with their children can be really essential in allowing them to stay resilient and present. Mm-hmm. How about one more thing you could imagine your meeting doing to support the spiritual mental health of the community in a disaster like this?
This is Laura from Middletown Meeting. What about providing food?
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
people?
Great. Good. Thank you. Thank you for these examples. It's really, I think this is a nice piggyback for any of you who've been to earlier sessions where my understanding is you've gone into detail about some of these physical supports that you can offer. And I love everything you said. These make a lot of sense to me. And what I want to offer here is now how we can tune in and add to these with the kind of emotional and kind of religious aspects that we are authorized to offer through the nature of the communities that you're in. So let's look at how this local church did respond. This was a real incident that happened in February of 2011. A gas explosion killed 5 residents, including an infant. This was in Allentown. And the local church, very shortly after, immediately held a worship to process what had happened. What they did that was a part of their plan that they were strategic about was that they invited media to attend, to publicize that people were gathering in the wake of this and that they were having a larger vigil. And they invited the general public to that. Subsequently, they hosted this larger vigil, this prayer event, and they made individual counseling available to members and non-members. When you start to think about the aspects that go, that might include meeting those immediate physical needs, like providing food or including activities for children, which we're going to talk about later. We want to, and then be thinking about kind of how we minister and how we bolster spiritually our community. We want to be tuned in if our house of worship is creating a plan that speaks to its members, to its attenders, if we're trying to minister in the community, and if we're trying to reach and offer support to the wider community. So we will use that to help us form the plan that we're making. Okay. Creating an effective preparedness plan for emotional, spiritual, and mental health is going to answer some of these questions. You can think about these as you formulate your plan. What is your immediate spiritual and mental health support plan? What resources would you put in place long-term to help members and families cope? Who is on call to support children, families, and other meeting members in such a crisis? Sometimes it's the committee for pastoral care. There might be certain people who've been elected to do something. And then what skills do they need to be effective? So you can just be thinking about this as we walk through. Okay. What's the most important role the faith community can play in healing after a disaster? Disasters cause loss of life, loved ones, valued possessions. When people have been traumatized, they need support from someone who genuinely cares and is concerned about them. It's not necessary, I'm going to argue, to have a clinical degree or training in mental health to be able to help. And when a disaster occurs, we can see that survivors have a lot of questions come up. And as people of faith, you in your communities can help survivors to feel witness to God's love and providing support without judgment to them as they're going through this. And I'm going to argue that beyond all of the important structural support that we can give, that we're really called to be present to those who are going through this in the moments of suffering, in the moments of confusion. That that's not about having the answers, but more about accompanying people as they make sense of what's going on. What can you do? you can be with people, encourage them in these chaotic moments, bring a compassionate involvement through the meeting and your members to allow your response to really shape your ministry and your recovery plan. Paul already mentioned, and I'll just mention again, that self-care is really, really important here. And it will be very noticeable when you go through this process, that the more that you also take time to step back and care for yourself, care for your family, the more you find you still have to give, because it can be a long haul. And we'll talk about some reasons for why that is when we're looking at a disaster. When we think about who we're supporting, the language that we use matters, because language is a tool for naming our identity. In the aftermath of a disaster, we may actually notice that folks who've experienced the disaster they identify themselves. And this can give us clues into where people are in the process. As folks speak about themselves as victims, we can feel that they may be really in the urgency and the suffering of that moment. When we hear people talking about themselves as survivors or thrivers, we may be tuning in that they're in a space of wanting to move through it, kind of trying to orient in a way that they can be more resilient. And we don't need to change people's language, but we can both use it as a way to assess where they are, and we can be choiceful around our own language, either being responsive to the language that they're using, or choosing language to support folks in their healing journey. It's also critical to understand that the impact of a disaster may be broad, deep, and also hidden. Those of us offering support need to discern the context. So we might be asking here, is the individual I'm working with, did they experience what happened directly? Like they've had their home destroyed, they've been separated from their family members, or is this individual someone who's been directly involved through recovery work, or is this a first responder who's been evacuating someone out of their home, who might have a secondary trauma that we need to be tuned into? Is this someone who lives in a neighboring community that has not been impacted by the disaster? And there we might see a mix of emotions. There might be some relief, there might be some survivor's guilt. Is this somebody who has repeatedly watched the event unfold on television? We had that experience with 9/11 as an example, that it was something that was getting seen over and over again, and that shifted how folks were able to process what was going on. Okay. In that context, we also want to be tuned in within our community for who we want to have an eye out for, who might be at greater risk for being impacted more, having more trouble being resilient in a natural disaster. And some to consider are young children and their parents or pregnant mothers, older adults, those with physical or intellectual disabilities, people who've experienced previous trauma, because this becomes then a cumulative experience, or those who are in marginalized, oppressed, or historically traumatized groups. Okay. So let's take a look here at what we might expect around adults. We're going to have a section here. We're going to look at what we might see in adult reactions and what we might expect to see in children's reactions, because we want our plan and we want our attunement to be ready for the normal responses that come from having been in a disaster, from having had real losses. And we also want to be able to normalize those, because it can be actually pretty disorienting for adults and children to be going through this. We can expect that some reactions we might see amongst adults are immobilization, kind of numbness, and inability to think or react the way one normally would, denial, not being able to accept the reality of this crisis. Like, I'm going to wake up out of this. This is a dream. This cannot be happening. We see more anxiety and more anger, both of which can be masks for, or kind of keep us activated and in action when we're feeling extra vulnerable and fearful. We can see, which makes sense, a real spike in adrenaline and kind of a can-do attitude. And when we see that, we also, as a community, we want to be holding a space and tuned in down the road, because this can create a lot of fatigue and mean there are different sets of needs, weeks or months later for those individuals. Self-doubt can come up, wondering, what did I do something wrong? Was there something I could have done to stop this from happening? And depression can happen. And this is a space I want to just make a note on death by suicide, which unfortunately we see a greater risk, not really when the event happens, but actually as people start to come out of depression, as they feel more kind of more capable, they feel more sometimes able to carry out a plan. And again, it's a reminder that what when we're focused on the immediate aftermath, that's really important. We want to be focused on maybe, repairing buildings, making sure people have food and housing. There's a second layer that's much longer lived. And those are, anniversaries that come up years later, reminders that can be triggered at any time. These are things that as a spiritual community, we don't want to forget. We want to stay with our members, whoever we're serving, to be able to let them know that we're with them, even though time has passed. Okay. Right, we're going to look at 3 phases of response to a trauma or a disaster. There are, there are many models, but we're just going to use this one as a way to think about places where we can intervene and offer support. When a natural disaster occurs, it affects people in different ways, but we do commonly see on an emotional level that there's this initial impact. Then there's kind of an immediate response, recoil phase, where we're trying to react to what's happening. We're trying to get control back. And then there's a recovery phase, which has, is longer. It has more ups and downs, where survivors try to make sense of what's happened and get to a new normal, so that they can move forward with the knowledge that life is different now. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the impact phase. The focus of spiritual and emotional care during the impact phase is to attend to and relieve acute emotional pain and help individuals function, which includes, just as was named, helping them find resources to meet their physical needs. Due to the chaos directly following a disaster or a tragedy, there can be gaps in aid. There could be duplication of aid. Folks can be afraid to reach out. People can feel a lot of anger, confusion, shock, denial. Some folks are really eager to be more in action, in this heroic energy. what can you do to support this kind of huge range? We really want to let survivors know what our role is. So you can let survivors know your role in the congregation. So if you're a pastor, you can, wear your clerical collar. If you're part of a committee, you can identify, everybody in this committee will be wearing X shirt if you need anything throughout today or in this week. Emergency response and other community leaders, they also need to know who you are, because they might be looking, who can I resource this person to? And then survivors need to be able to distinguish you from government and other national services that are being provided, as a distinction from volunteers who may just show up without an organization backing them. And sometimes they do great work, but you want your community, they also might not be trustworthy. So you want your community to kind of be stating up front who it is that you've elected to put forward to support in the emergent, chaos. We want to follow up and encourage others to follow the instruction of local and national government agencies. This was a time, if a crime was committed, for example, we know the sheriff is in charge of the scene, and we're all responsive to that. So in a natural disaster, it might be emergency management, fire, police, National Guard. We want to signal that we're working with them. We want to direct survivors to needed assistance, particularly emergency services. We want to reassure survivors that they're safe if they are safe. And if they're not, we want to be, on call to try to make that happen. We want to let survivors tell their stories and really focus on them. When we can, we want to take time to listen and express our sincerity, our concern. This can take the form of praying with victims, with survivors, with people who've been impacted by the disaster. And where we see guilt come up, we want to help folks discern what that's about. Often guilt can come up, even when a tragedy is not their fault. So we want to acknowledge that if somebody, I see a hand, I'll respond to it in a second. That like if there's been an accident in a plant, for example, someone may have had a role in that. And that's guilt that they hold. But children, as a in a natural disaster, may carry guilt for something they don't have responsibility for. So we want to be attuned and listening for that. Yes.
Oh yeah, you said you were gonna go.
Nora, we have a hand raised.
Yes.
Okay.
Disaster mitigation specialist and a first responder. My experience is that, especially when there's been physical loss and damage,
Yeah.
people are very frightful and feeling hopeless. And just rather than just directing them to emergency assistance, is giving them the assurance that there is assistance available to mitigate their concerns.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, because it's a faulty assumption to think people are just going to show up at our door and say, who's going to help me with this or that. And actually our role might be more so, as you're pointing out, being that safe space or the known space that already has in mind who's helping with what, and in a more subtle way, scoping out what's needed. And trying to make those connections, not assuming people are coming forward right away. Am I understanding what you're saying?
In part, it's really just, rather than directing people to assistance, assuring them that there is assistance and what form that assistance may take relative to their immediate concerns, so that
Right.
not worried about how they're going to have food, clothing, and shelter, or other support.
Right, right. Having kind of actually the information, the confidence to say, we can meet these needs, and we have enough information about what's out there to help make that happen. Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is the first phase. The second phase is the immediate response or recoil phase. And this is the time when crisis intervention is most likely to be needed, and then grief counseling might begin. After a tragedy, people are overwhelmed. Many of them are in shock. And, for healing, often a very powerful tool is the tool of narrative, of telling their stories. As a community and as leaders, one thing we can do is, if spaces or people have been affected, as soon as it's safe, we can express the interest to actually visit them and walk through the affected areas and listen to individuals talk about their story. That can really help people feel seen. Not just helps with the healing process, but just exactly as you were saying, it can be a moment, rather than hoping people come to us, going to them, and that can be a moment where we identify specific needs that folks are having. We can report these needs to emergency personnel or a designated helping service as it's appropriate. During this response phase, survivors are concerned about safety. But some might be in denial about the extent of what their needs are. If their homes have been damaged, then we're gonna concentrate on finding safe, sanitary, temporary housing. And we can expect to encounter individuals who are already, just like you were saying, feeling really frightened, feeling really helpless, that they might fear they've been abandoned, and we can be a voice to say, you have not been abandoned. We can really listen to them about what their needs are, about what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. We want them to know not just that we're providing solutions, that we have ideas about where help can come from, but that emotionally we're a safe space as a community and as individuals. And in that spirit, we want to be not judgmental. We want to not try to change their feelings. We want to not be saying, I know how you feel, but rather, I don't know how you feel, but can you share with me what this is like? Or I've had similar feelings, but can you tell me more about what's happening for you here? And when in doubt, when we think about our role as spiritual companions, we want to remember that silence, we know as Quakers, silence is golden. We can be just a physical presence. That can mean more to somebody than coming up with really perfect words or theological statements for what they're going through. And we, as I said, we want to be accepting of feelings of guilt, and we also want to help work with people to move through when it's what we would call unreasonable guilt. We want to help work with survivors to gain control and authority. And we want to magnify their positive reactions. So as they start to feel like they have found an inner strength through this experience, we want to magnify that. We want to be a mirror for their strength, and we want to really validate it. And finally, in this stage, we want to make sure we're getting enough rest. We're taking care of ourselves. Okay. And then there's the recovery phase. And the recovery phase is when those who've suffered a loss start to look toward a new future. During this phase, we can help survivors find healing by participating as much as possible in recovery. So they really feel ownership over the decisions that are being made and the changes that are happening in their life. We want to be aware that new needs start to emerge. And, again, thinking about how and when people do outreach, the recovery phase is sometimes when people start to come out of the woodwork that did not previously ask for help. And it may be that they have now, after a period of time, depleted their physical or financial resources, maybe that they have depleted their emotional and spiritual resources. And there can be this kind of second wave of folks who need connection and support. The response of our meeting and our local churches becomes even more important in this time, because this is often when disaster support and all of the funding for that, often that starts to leave. But the reality that things are very different and that there have been real losses remains. And then our communities of faith, we matter even more to not forget to keep showing up. The kind of prolonged nature of this can be really confusing for people experiencing it. It can be overwhelming, and it can go on for months or years. So we really want to be grounded in this phase, remembering that people are emerging different. Their lives are different, and they can't return to their lives the way they were before. So we want to help survivors look toward the future and work to get a new definition of what normal is, and having a space being held in the way that you can make a big difference in folks' resiliency in that process. Okay. I want to give just a couple kind of guiding principles for providing spiritual care. One is to meet, accept, and respect people as they are, where they are in their process, and to hold the intention to really do no harm in whatever we do. We want to nurture and encourage each person's own spiritual perspective to be a source of strength in difficult times. We want to protect confidentiality when it's appropriate, and that can be an important thing to discern. We want to respect social diversity and cross-cultural settings. And in our plan, we might actually want to foster that and think in advance about how to be ready to plug into different community organizations where we can foster that kind of cross-cultural collaboration. We want to function at levels appropriate to our training and educational background. I'm able to hold a listening circle, but someone is having a breakdown at the end and needs some crisis management. Who can I refer them to at that point? And then I want to understand and normalize what happened. Okay. Here are a few best practices for supporting healing. Normalizing, again, talking about what happened, and really normalizing people's internal experience. Because when you're in very intense shifts, it can feel very disorienting. We want to carry out spiritual care through the practice of our presence. We've talked a lot about that. We want to identify and solve immediate concrete problems. That's also a part of spiritual ministry. We want to encourage individuals to talk about their experience. And we want to be active listeners, but we also want to create environments where active listening is possible. We want to recognize normal stress reactions like that list you saw before, make referrals to address immediate problems, And rather than turning away from people who are having that range of reactions, lean in and support them. And we want to attend to and anticipate anniversaries and other important dates. And that's a part of the long game of offering spiritual support, is that we're planning ahead to be able to keep tuning in to how this impacts our community well after it's happened. Okay. Yeah, and we're just shifting to talk about children. So this is a great time to have any questions. And I see somebody raised a hand, but it disappeared. Feel free to unmute.
You elaborate what you mean by normalizing?
Yes. Well, two things. One is when something has happened, just making sense of it, that things are different. It's not a norm for us to be in a disaster setting. So kind of the rules of the game, so to speak, shift. And normalizing in that case might be, validating that things are different and validating that what the future is going to look like may not be what the past looked like. That doesn't mean that somebody has failed in processing what's going on. And then normalizing, people's reactions, and offering support there. Any other questions or comments in this section? Okay, we've talked some about adults and there is overlap, but we're going to talk about reactions from children, because children also have unique ways that they express being overwhelmed, being disoriented, and they also have there are unique ways that we can support children who have much more access to their creative mind and may need more nonverbal supports. But one piece that is very distinct with children is that when there are big changes, the shift in routine can be one of the hardest. It's very stabilizing for children to know what they can expect in the day-to-day. And so not being able to do that can really create issues for them with their kind of safety, their sense of stress, and prolonged grieving. And we may see for children hopelessness, depression, guilt, withdrawal, and we're working with them in contexts where they're in groups where they need to participate and do things in meeting or in school. And so we can also expect after a disaster that we will see more issues in behavior and academic performance as well. I want to show a film that is about, it's interviews with folks who were children not too long ago and then children a decade ago in talking about their response to a natural disaster. And this is an opportunity to see some of the longer lasting impacts and the ways that folks did or were not able to help them be buffered from some of the kind of hardest parts. Okay.
Katrina stays on my mind. It's like she there when I wake up, go to sleep, all through the day. After my daddy died, I really felt like I just don't have nothing to live for. Like that was all I had, and now since he gone, I don't need to be here. But like if I didn't have my kids like on a daily basis, I'll be trying to figure out like how to kill myself or something.
Being in the Superdome, there was a lot of rape, there was a lot of killing. I was only 14 and I had to be a man.
I was more concerned about my baby cousin because she had heart issues The National Guards had shot a guy because he went through the over the barricade, and everybody just started running, and they really almost like ran over our cousin, like trampled over her.
When they have an earthquake in Nepal and you send 150,000 soldiers in 8 hours, we were, what, how many hours are we from DC? And it took them 7 days. Like, you gotta be kidding me. Did you not care at all?
We didn't matter to society. That's what I honestly felt, and it hurt as a little girl growing up to feel that way.
Now I have to be that adult that has a heart when it's like, you didn't give me one. Why should I have to give you one?
My emotions towards the tornado, it was really weird. I didn't feel anything. It was just a dull pain.
He spends a lot of time in the house. His grades are not doing so well.
It just feels like, what are you working for?
If someone starts talking about the tornado or what they've experienced, I just have a bunch of like flashbacks.
That's how this kind of panic anxiety works with this trauma, is that you can feel fine and then see something or somebody say a word and then all of a sudden you're back.
Weatherman comes up and says, oh, there's going to be rain, torrential rains, or my son would go into a panic. You know, not again, not again. That continued for a while, and he had the nightmares, you know, my daughter as well. This morning it was raining. She was in a panic. She didn't want to go, she didn't want to leave, she didn't want to go to camp. It's raining, when is it going to stop? Is it going to stop?
For my son, it messed up a lot. He wasn't able to play like he used to. He wasn't able to go to the park. He wasn't able to see the people he saw on a daily basis. It stopped him from talking. It stopped him from wanting to feed himself, wanting to play. He just pretty much stayed immobilized.
What did you say about your youngest sister?
We haven't found her yet.
If she doesn't get counseling, she will be stuck emotionally and mentally at 9 years old with a tragedy.
They say time heals all wounds, but I don't think that's true in certain cases. Nobody teaches you like, oh, if such and such happened and this happens, this how you go on with your life.
It's hugely important that they have many outlets to go to find help and resources walking through these things.
With the right support, kids can get through anything, really, with the right support.
It's a pretty powerful video. I would love to just hear a couple reflections from these testimonies. What did you hear that could be helpful to you to keep in mind as you think about how you might support your community if there were a disaster you were responding to? And feel free to just unmute and share.
I was particularly struck by the woman who said, you know, you send 150,000 soldiers to Nepal in an earthquake, and yet how far are we from Washington, D.C.? And we waited, you know, weeks or whatever, week or, you know, 7 days or I don't know how long she said. or 7 weeks or 7 months. I don't know what she said about, but it's an incredibly long time.
Yeah.
Even though there are people who write in our country who didn't get that response at all, and that really hurt.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yes, absolutely.
My name's Marcia, Westtown meeting. I was just struck by if we can do nothing else, we can hold space.
Yeah.
We can listen. We can just be there to, as you said, to let them tell their story, to let them know that there is someone there that cares how they feel, what they've been through, and that we're not going to go away, that we will continue to be there, to do what can be done, and to ask them what it is they need.
Yeah. It's really striking, isn't it, that we have this contrast of one of the women saying so clearly, kids are resilient and kids can heal. And yet in the absence of feeling loving, caring adults, of having a structure to process and make meaning, of having, activities, of even feeling the kind of immediate swooping in and helping, right? Those 7 days were agony to wait. They can't be resilient. So you're really naming, we cannot forget this aspect of spiritual and emotional care. This is the key piece. This is the core of ensuring a really, that our children come out with the possibility of being whole again.
This is Paula. I also wanted to add two elements that obviously this is extremely emotional, evoking. It's terribly painful. But two things that come up for me are, one is the importance of our meetings in their preparation plans, to actually have a response team identified. We know who our children are. We know if we have programs in our meetings that care for children, and we know how to reach out to those families, so that the structures in place to be helpful. And the other one I want to name, which someone else mentioned earlier when they suggested, well, we could provide childcare for families who need to be busy responding, is look at those parents. Those parents are really suffering on behalf of their children and seeking support. So including in our awareness that this is a really multidimensional crisis for the children and their folks. And as for those of us that have daycare centers or first day schools or affiliated with schools, to encourage those schools and those programs to be thinking ahead the way we're trying to think ahead. So just add those two dimensions. But what a powerful experience to watch.
I also, to piggyback on that, want to add that, Westtown monthly meeting that I'm a part of has really been stepping up their commitment to diversity and to supporting, historically marginalized and traumatized groups and folks in our community. And so when you think about having a plan, we don't always have reach to people who are not just directly in our community in the day-to-day. And so if we want to really think about, right, it wasn't all of New Orleans that got impacted. It was really those low-income communities that were devastated by Katrina. And so if we want to be ready to help those, we could say who are more at risk, to have additional trauma layered onto trauma they're already carrying, we may want to create partnerships in advance. We may want to build into our plan Who are we collaborating with? Who are we checking with in terms of what kind of spiritual and emotional support is needed? Who needs that we offer these listening circles or offer childcare or create some programming? And it may not just be the children in our meeting, depending on the mission of our plan. Okay. I think we can take maybe one more comment if somebody has something burning. Otherwise, we'll keep going. Thanks. These are all important. Right. All right, let's break some of this down for children in particular. What are some of the risk and protective factors? Risk factors being anything that's going to make it more likely that this is going to be a traumatic event, or that we're going to create a regression. Seeing something over and over again can be traumatizing. And now with social media, this is more risky. So having some parameters when we are holding space around if something is just happened, we might say, okay, if something happens, we are going to limit exposure. We're going to say, parents can have contact with us, otherwise kids are without their phones or something like that. We need to think about what are we doing to protect kids in the moment from having 24/7 access to news that can be really scary and above their level to process. We want to tune into the proximity of the event to each individual and how that will impact how difficult it is to be resilient in responding. And we want to be tuning in to which children are coping with multiple losses at the same time. We can either be doing that by really knowing our community well, who has just lost their dog, who has a parent who's dealing with illness, or by having created partnerships where we can already target some communities who are predictably dealing with more traumas already and be offering extra support there. How about some protective factors, some positive forces that can help our children to be adaptive? And, one is just you responding, having an organized meeting response, a structure for children to lean into can be hugely healing and supportive. Creating space for children to listen and reflect, it can be really inspiring to see what children are capable of when they're given some space. We already talked about limiting media exposure, having calm, present adults. And that might mean limiting, if we're kind of stuck in some setting, we're waiting to be picked up or we're waiting for a flood to pass. It might mean limiting even adult exposure. So the adults aren't getting so anxious. And then offering prayerful activities that give meaning to what has happened, and maybe even letting children be involved in kind of the planning or the carrying out of some of those events. Okay. The end goal for adults and children, but we're focusing here on children, is to foster post-traumatic growth. We talk a lot about PTSD, but that's not the only way that these stories end. That film was so powerful. We really saw where they were missing the opportunity to make meaning and grow beyond what happened. And we know that nobody will make us fill that gap. We have to choose to step up, to be the people that, and the community, the organization that people can look to see what healthy processing looks like, to understand what kind of resources they have available to them. So our goal is to foster resiliency and ultimately create an environment where there can be post-traumatic growth. So many people believe that even though they survived a traumatic experience and have been negatively impacted, they've also grown or been strengthened by the experience. And I think the film that we saw really speaks to the way that adults hold what has happened can be the defining factor in whether or not that happens. All right, here are some ideas of ways that we can work with children. Children will not be as articulate with their words as we are. And using art and dramatic play can be such an extraordinary opportunity. This is an example of in a school setting where they gave every kid a board and they could either write or draw. You can see the first kid wrote, "I survived the flood," and they did a parade to celebrate that they were survivors, they were thrivers, they weren't victims. And you can say the next one, it's like a whole drawing or a map. So each of them got to own that process. Also, again, even for little kids, we can create peer listening teams. And then we want to be flexible and also we want to expect that children can't wear the clothing they were supposed to wear because now they don't have access to it, or that they may be behaving unpredictably. We have a tendency when we're stressed, we want to get more rigid, but we want to remember that this is a moment where children need us to be more flexible or suspend rules that have been the norm. Some things may happen at another time and we will be supporting folks after, but some things may happen during first day school or during class if you're in a school setting. So in those situations, just a few things to think about are limiting exposure to media, either so that parents can talk about what's happened with them and be at choice how they talk about it, or so that it can be one sharing about it rather than having them see it over and over. It may be creating a kind of business as usual, or like somebody shared, promoting connecting activities, or actually having something really positive and structured for kids to be engaging with to keep their mind off of what's happening, and to be methodical in transitions to maintain calmness and efficiency. And again, this is the purpose of the plans that you're creating, is that in a moment where there is a crisis, you will not be whoever's like on first day school or responsible for the meeting that day. It will not be easy to think of like fun interactive games. These are things you can think up ahead of time and have them ready in your back pocket should you need them. Let's again normalize reactions to stress in a disaster for children. Questioning justice, fairness, the meaning of their lives and what's happened. Feeling far away from beliefs that they previously held. Suddenly turning to God or turning away from God. Being really angry at the leaders in the community or God for allowing this to happen. Feeling disconnected or kind of meaningless in familiar practices or religious practices that used to be comforting. Okay, so let's just take a few minutes if anyone needs to go to the bathroom or get a drink of water, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. So we'll come back just shortly before 5:15. All right. Welcome back, everybody. We don't have much more of the presentation left, so I hope that was enough of a break, and we will we'll carry on. I want to give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit on your meeting, your house of worship, and what role you might play, how you might create a moment for your community to gather, how you might create a space for folks to process what's going on, as an opportunity to see healthy communication, to model what really showing up and supporting is. Worship, the structure of worship can really be that. If you have a pen and paper handy, I would like to invite you to just briefly reflect on these questions, or you could type it into your phone. When would a meeting for worship in response to a natural disaster occur? Would you wait until there was a programmed meeting? Would you call a meeting later that day? You'll have time to elaborate on your plan, but just as a base, when might you call a worship? I'm going to give some ideas about how to plan ahead for worship opportunities. Please feel free to write any of this down as to jog your memory later as you go back and create your own plans. Establish whether the conditions exist in that moment so that the community can gather for worship as usual or as close to usual. Will our worship focus on our faith community, or is there a need and is there an appropriate time to gather for a larger interdenominational worship? If for a larger interdenominational worship, who will coordinate this? So again, who is the population we're writing this plan for, and does it go beyond our meeting or church? If your meeting or house of worship has been damaged, where would you gather instead? What arrangements need to be put in place now for that to be possible? Is your response team authorized to create this worship opportunity, or is it someone else's responsibility? So we're kind of covering, who, where, and if normal communication channels are affected, what other options do you have? Okay, here are some suggestions for worship. Again, in advance, as you create a plan can always be modified, but consider choosing some readings, queries, or biblical texts that speak a word of comfort or promise to those affected by disaster. Ask the community about spiritual teachings or stories that resonate to them with their current situation. Consider including a time of lament that names the destruction and sorrow. All laments include a turn to promise and renewal. This is an interesting thing that Paula can share in the resources following up, but it's a kind of an experiential process that allows people to sort of move through aspects of grief in a religious and spiritual context. Include significant time for prayer, and sing songs that are known by the community and recall times of comfort and promise. Choose songs that are easily sung, refrains, songs that are known by the community by heart. Again, in a crisis, songs will not be the first thing that come to your mind, but if you build them into a plan, you can foster a sense of hopefulness that you may not even be able to access without the support of a structure when the time comes. Okay, let's see. Great. I think we've still got some time. So I want to open this to the group and take a moment to put some of these suggestions into practice. Yeah, let's see. Let's put it into practice here. Let's imagine that there have been 3 days of extreme weather, including thunderstorms, high winds, power outages, and over 30 families in the community have been displaced. There have been 3 water rescues required from cars, and 2 children have been hospitalized. Looking back at thinking about creating an opportunity to gather, how might we respond and hold a space for the community? And we don't need to map it all out, but just what are some things that come to mind in an example like this?
Some of the Psalms of Lament, the Psalms of David, the Psalms of Lament do have that turn to reciting the faithfulness of God, even in times of disaster and loss. That's certainly a spiritual resource for worship.
So you might put out a notice, and maybe as soon as folks can move easily, invite people to gather and have a time for singing and together. Yeah, that's a great idea.
I was going to mention that when you talked about communications systems can break down, and in the old days we used to have phone trees that I don't think we have anymore, and I'm not even sure we have each other's phone numbers, and if really we couldn't communicate with each other, I'm just thinking, for instance, 3 days of extreme weather, power outages, etc. It does seem to me as though one plan would be to have a list of our most vulnerable members, and when it's safe, try to visit people, physically visit people, and have a plan about who would do that because they live nearby, that kind of thing. And I also wanted to say, I think if the communication system isn't totally broken down, that all of us, because of the pandemic, most of us have learned how to do worship online. So maybe we have someone on our response team who sends out a message that says we're going to have worship sharing online at these hours. Make any of them that are available, but we could take advantage of the technology that most of us are now familiar with to give people a safe space to come for worship sharing.
Yeah. I was thinking to add to that, that if you had folks you had on that list, you did some home visits, just like the example that we looked at the beginning, where they had an immediate worship, then they planned a bigger worship, and they used that immediate worship to get the media there and to invite people to this larger gathering. You could have like that, rather than trying to get people into an in-person meeting the next day. You could have those visits be the opportunity to invite people, so they have something to look forward to, a time to gather and process, even if it's a week down the road. And I love the suggestion of impromptu worship happening online right away. That invitation, like, you are a part of this, come join in. You do not need to be alone. Yeah, thank you. These were all great ideas. Okay, good. So I hope that you're walking away with some really concrete ideas of how your meeting, your church community, your school can offer leadership in this area in times of disaster, and also that you're really feeling the importance and the impact of needing to minister at a spiritual and emotional level, not just at a physical level. And I would love to leave some space open here at the end for anything you're taking away, anything you could imagine would be helpful to you as you start to create your plans, and also any other feedback or reflections.